bread and mead of the Sídhe. The forest of Glenismole did not begin with a clear boundary, but with a surrender of light. For Con, who had been walking for 3 days with the weight of his tool bag rhythmically striking his left thigh, entering the thick woods was not a transgression, but an immersion. The summer that, in the plains of Meath, manifested as a heavy golden hum over the barley fields, here transformed into a green, humid dimness, an air that tasted of old bark and the slow breathing of dark earth. Con paused beside an oak stump covered in grey lichen. He leaned his back against the living trunk beside it and let his leather pack fall to the ground. The impact produced a dull sound, a faint clink of metal against metal. The curved gouges, the broad-bladed chisels, the applewood mallet his father had carved for him when his hands were still too small to fully close around the handle. They were the only possessions that did not dissolve with the changing seasons. He pulled a rough linen cloth from his bag and wiped the sweat from his brow, studying his fingers. The nails were darkened with pine resin, marked by small white scars, fine lines that recorded every moment when steel had moved faster than caution. A woodcarver, he often thought, is a man who spends half his life apologizing to trees for wanting to see what lies inside them. The forest around him seemed to be holding its breath. It was the afternoon of the solstice, the day when the sun pauses at the peak of the sky like a weary bird before beginning its slow descent toward winter. In the villages he had left behind, women would already be weaving wreaths of clover and rue, while men stacked dry ash logs on the hills to light the bonfires of unhurried. But here, beneath the vault of interlaced branches, no fire could rival the stubbornness of shadow. Con weighed the remaining light filtering through the leaves. An ordinary man would have quickened his pace, seeking the edge of the path before dusk erased the roots protruding from the ground like knotted fingers. But Con was in no hurry. Time, for someone who spends weeks polishing the curve of a walnut bowl, loses its sharpness. Haste is an illness of the plains. In the forest, everything worth doing takes years to complete. He slung his pack back over his shoulder, adjusting the strap across the one that still ached from the strain of the last winter, and resumed walking. His soft leather footwear, tied with hemp cords up to the ankle, sank gently into the carpet of decaying leaves. With each step, an ancient, clean scent rose from the ground, a blend of sweet fungus and wet stone. As he moved forward, the path began to narrow, shrinking into little more than a suggestion between ferns taller than his waist. Their fronds and intense green that bordered on black brushed his hands with the feel of cold silk. Con let his fingers slide over them, sensing the hidden rows of spores underneath like a form of braille only the blind or the wandering could read. The silence of the forest was not an absence of sound, but a complex texture made of small surrenders. The distant call of a thrush settling into its nest, the rubbing of 2 beech branches swaying in a breeze strong above the canopy but barely a whisper below, the unseen rustle of some small creature hiding under moss at the vibration of his steps. "Don't hurry," he murmured to himself. His own voice felt strange, heavy, like a stone dropped into a deep, dense well. He had not spoken to anyone since paying for his last bowl of oats in the tavern of Kilmeaden with an alder spoon, 30 miles back. He stopped before a young ash tree whose trunk split into a perfect curve, like a human neck leaning in to hear a secret. Con pressed his palm against the smooth bark. It was cold, but beneath the surface he thought he could feel a muted pulse, the slow rising flow of sap from Ireland's deepest roots to the highest leaves, barely touched by the last light of day. Trees do not sleep at the solstice, they watch. They know it is the night when the boundary between what endures and what passes becomes as thin as a dragonfly's wing. He walked on, and as the light shifted, The bright green of afternoon deepened into violet, an ashen clarity that did not fall from the sky but seemed to seep from the cracks in the rocks themselves. The air grew heavier, the scent of resin sharper, now blending with a subtle, almost imperceptible fragrance that made him stop. The sweet, distant smell of ripe apples. It was an absurd scent for June. Apples in Glenismole would not be ready until the first frosts of autumn bit into the orchard trees of the abbeys. And yet it was there, drifting among the oaks like a persistent memory. Con inhaled deeply, feeling the cold air fill his lungs and clear his mind. He did not feel fear. A man who spends his life among trees learns that nature is not logical but just. It has its own reasons and its own calendars, and most of the time humans are only careless witnesses. The ground began to slope downward, guiding him into a hollow where mist wove white threads among the hawthorn bushes. The hawthorn, the tree of the fair folk, was in full bloom, its white petals like fallen stars holding the last light of day. Con knew he must not touch its branches on a night like this. Courtesy toward the forest was the only law a traveler could not afford to forget. Suddenly, the murmur of the wind changed. It was no longer the regular hiss through the treetops, but something more articulated. A continuous murmur like water flowing over flat pebbles, or the whisper of many voices speaking at once in the next room. Careful not to wake a sleeping child, Con turned left, abandoning what remained of the path. His feet no longer followed any trail made by men or cattle, but the invitation of that sound and the increasingly clear trace of apples and beeswax. His fingers no longer brushed ferns but wild mint, which released a sharp freshness underfoot, competing with the growing weight of night. Darkness settled fully, though it was not a black night. It was a bluish twilight, translucent, where the shapes of trees stood out against the sky with almost painful clarity. Stars began to appear, not fixed points, but trembling drops of silver scattered across the dark linen of the shortest night of the year. Con reached a place where ancient oaks formed a natural arch, their branches so interwoven that no undergrowth could grow beneath them. The ground here was covered in thick, soft moss that swallowed all sound. It was like walking on virgin wool, passing between two of these knotted giants whose trunks required the outstretched arms of 4 men to encircle the forest opened. It was not an ordinary clearing. It was a perfect circular space, a natural basin where the earth seemed to have gently sunk to protect whatever took place at its center. The edges were marked by a ring of grey stones, worn by centuries of rain, almost hidden beneath clover and late primroses. In the center there were no roaring fires or smoky torches. Instead, there was a different kind of brightness, a luminance rising from the grass itself and from small pale globes of light, apple-sized, floating at a man's chest height, drifting slowly like dandelion seeds in an August afternoon. Con stopped beneath the shadow of the last oak, one hand resting on its rough bark. He felt his heartbeat in his fingertips, a rapid rhythm that gradually eased as his eyes adjusted to what he was seeing. There they were, the Sídhe, the people of peace, the ancient lords of the hills before men brought iron and plough. They did not resemble the creatures from old tales told by grandmothers to frighten children into coming home before dusk. No insect wings, no twisted faces. They were beings of similar stature to Con, some taller, more slender, their silhouettes carved as if from the same noble wood he himself respected. Their clothing carried the colors of winter birch bark, dry moss, wool dyed with walnut husk and elderberries. They moved with an effortless grace, as if the very air of the clearing had a different density that supported and guided them. About 3 dozen of them were scattered across the clearing. Some sat on the outer stones, hands resting on their knees, watching the center with large dark eyes that did not reflect the floating lights but seemed to contain their own inner night. Others walked in pairs, speaking in the language Con had heard from a distance, an idiom without hard consonants made only of long vowels and breath-like sounds like wind passing through the keyhole of an ancient door. In the center stood a low table of black oak, a fallen trunk polished by time, not cut by human hands. Holding large clay bowls and grey stone jugs, there was none of the disorder of human feasts, no smell of roasting fat or stale beer. The air smelled of freshly baked rye bread, wild honey drawn from chestnut trunks, and that same primordial apple scent that had guided Con for the last mile. A woman with long hair, the color of dry linen, stepped away from the central group. She wore a rough spun tunic that moved like flowing water, its color shifting between mist gray and lichen green as she passed through the floating lights. She walked toward the edge of the clearing, directly toward the oak where Con stood motionless, his pack on his shoulder and his hands at his sides. Con did not move. He knew that fleeing in the forest of the Sídhe was the surest way to never find the way back, to end up walking in circles inside one's own mind until the body turned into mulch. Besides, he felt no need to escape. There was something in the atmosphere of that clearing, an absolute restorative stillness that dissolved the chronic pain in his shoulder and the accumulated exhaustion of days of travel, leaving only a lightness he had not felt since youth. The woman stopped 3 paces away. She carried no weapons, no gold rings, no insignia of human kings. Her face was young, but her eyes held the quality Con had only seen in western cliffs, the gaze of something that has watched 10,000 waves break and remains unchanged. "The woodcarver has left his maps in the river," she said. Her voice did not echo in the air. It formed directly behind Con's eyes, like a thought he had not consciously made but recognized as true. Con inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect not born of submission but of craft acknowledging craft. "Maps are no use when the forest decides to change its place," he replied softly, almost in a whisper. The woman smiled faintly, like the ripple left when a leaf touches still water. "Come, Con of the 3 ashes, the night is short for your kind, but here time is a fabric we can stretch to fit all who need rest. Your pack is heavy, but what you carry within it is not what weighs you down the most." She stepped aside, inviting him into the circle with a motion of her right hand. Her fingers were long and fine, unmarked by labor, and yet Con felt certain those hands understood the formation of every grain inside a tree, long before a seed touched the soil. Con looked back at the dim forest he had just left. The path was gone. Only a dense wall of bluish foliage and mist remained. Then he looked at the clearing, the soft light rising from the ground, and the figures watching him with calm curiosity rather than hostility. He dropped his pack at the foot of the protective oak as one sheds an unnecessary armor and took his first step into the ring of stones. As he crossed the threshold, a subtle shiver ran down his spine, as if he had stepped into a river of warm water flowing against the wind. The solstice night had just opened its doors wide, and Con, the solitary woodcarver, had no intention of closing them. What Con did to cross the ring of stones was not an ordinary physical movement. It was a silent transgression. As he placed his left foot onto the moss covering the edge of the clearing, he felt a subtle resistance, as if the air itself had the density of thick honey. A sharp vibration, like the highest note of a willow harp, echoed at the base of his skull. It was not painful, but it carried a final, unmistakable warning. He was leaving behind the world of men, the world where time is measured in harvests and wrinkles, and entering a domain where the rules were written by stone and star. On the other side, the air was lighter, colder, and paradoxically more alive. The scent of apples and honey that had guided him there intensified until it became almost tangible, a sweet taste at the back of his throat. The heaviness he had carried in his shoulders for days dissolved instantly, like mist under rising sun. Con felt strangely weightless, as though his body were no longer bound to the laws of the earth, but instead floating just above the emerald moss carpeting the clearing. The Sídhe woman who had received him, whom Con now recognized as a figure of authority by the way the others made space for her, walked beside him. She did not guide him by the hand, nor signal direction with gestures. She simply moved, and Con found himself following her with a natural pull, like iron to a magnet. "This is the vigil clearing," she said, her voice once again resonating directly in Con's mind, bypassing his ears. "In your world, men fear darkness and light fires to drive it away. Here, we celebrate the light as it withdraws, because we know that without shadow, rest has no value." Con observed the Sídhe more closely as he walked. They were not the ethereal, idealized creatures of romantic ballads. They were beings of an ancient and unsettling beauty, one closer to the functional perfection of a hawk in flight, or the elegance of an oak root than to human symmetry. Their faces were angular, with high cheekbones and sharp chins. Their eyes were large, almond-shaped, with no visible pupils. Instead, they held deep, star-filled night, or the still reflection of a moonlit lake. Their ears tapered into subtle points that disappeared into long, silky hair of flaxen blonde, oxidized copper, or deep jet black. Their garments, though rough in appearance, possessed an organic texture that Con, as a craftsman, found fascinating. They seemed woven, not from ordinary thread, but from spider silk infused with dew, layered autumn leaves hardened into cloth, and the hides of animals that had died of old age and surrendered their coverings willingly. There was no metal in their clothing, no iron clasps, no bronze buckles. Everything was fastened with flexible leather cords or white thorn spikes carved into shape. Con felt a deep sting of envy watching the way they moved. There was no clumsiness in them, no hesitation, no misstep. They walked in perfect synchrony with their surroundings, as though their feet already knew where every root and stone lay before touching the ground. It was the same connection he felt when his chisel slid effortlessly along the grain of noble wood, but extended to every aspect of their existence. They arrived at the central table, the black oak trunk polished by time. The Sídhe woman paused and gestured gently toward the bowls and jugs resting on its surface. "We do not offer you meat, Con of the Three Ashes, for we do not take life to sustain our own," she said, and for the first time Con detected a note of melancholy in her voice. "We share what the earth gives willingly, the sweetness of fruit, the strength of grain, and the purity of water flowing from the heart of the hill." Con looked at the bowls. They contained wild berries of sizes and colors he had never seen in his world. Blackberries dark as coal, blueberries as large as quail eggs with a metallic sheen, and red mulberries like suspended drops of blood in the light. There were flat loaves of bread baked on hot stones, releasing a scent of rye and cumin so intense it made his mouth water. And there were grey stone jugs filled with a golden, translucent liquid that bubbled faintly. The hill mead, fermented with honey from bees that fed only on blue flax flowers. He realized there were no individual plates or utensils. Everything was shared, a communal feast without hierarchy in eating. The Sídhe approached the table calmly, took a berry between two fingers, broke off a piece of bread, and retreated to the edges of the clearing to eat in silence, eyes fixed on the floating lights. Con, despite the hunger that had followed him into the clearing, hesitated. He remembered the warnings of the elders. To eat the food of the Sídhe was to accept their dominion, a way of becoming trapped forever in their world. but the woman seemed to read his thoughts once more. "The warnings of your world belong to those who are afraid," she said, her voice sharpening, almost commanding. "We are not captors, Khan. We are hosts. The food we offer is a gift from the earth, not a trap. Drink the mead and eat the bread, and the fatigue of your journey will dissolve. But do so with gratitude, not greed." Khan nodded slowly. He took a piece of rye bread. It was warm as if freshly taken from an oven, dense and comforting in texture. As he bit into it, a burst of flavor spread through him that went far beyond simple nourishment. It felt as though he were consuming the very essence of sun and soil that had grown the grain. He lifted one of the grey stone jugs and took a sip of the mead. The liquid was sweet, with a bitter undertone of wild herbs, and it immediately spread warmth through his entire body, from the tips of his fingers to his toes. The chronic pain in his left shoulder and old winter injury vanished completely, leaving behind a surge of vitality he had not felt in years. He set the jug down and turned to the woman. "My name is Khan, and I am a woodcarver. I have little to offer in return for your hospitality, except my craft." The woman smiled, and this time it was warmer, more human. "Your craft is what defines you, Khan, and here we value craft more than gold. Gold is only yellow stone that men covet. But a piece of wood carved with reverence is a testament to the connection between the world above and the world below." She gestured toward the group of Sídhe gathered near the stones of the outer ring. "Come, the celebration has only just begun. The night is short, and we have much to celebrate." Khan followed her, increasingly at ease in that strange but strangely familiar place. They approached the group of Sídhe. There were no formal introductions, no loud greetings. The Sídhe simply opened the circle to include him with a naturalness that made Khan feel as though he had always belonged there. He sat on a smooth stone covered in deep green moss that seemed to vibrate with energy. Beside him, a young Sídhe with copper-colored hair reminiscent of autumn leaves held a strange musical instrument. It resembled a harp, but instead of wood and metal, it seemed formed from intertwined willow branches and strands of spider silk glowing faintly with their own light. The copper-haired Sídhe began to play. It was not a dance tune or a loud melody, but a soft, ethereal music that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The notes were long and sustained, creating an atmosphere of stillness and contemplation. As he played, the floating lights drifting through the clearing began to move in harmony with the music, tracing intricate, shifting patterns in the air. Khan closed his eyes and surrendered to the melody. For the first time in many years, he felt no need to be anywhere else, to do anything else. Time, which in the world of men was an unstoppable river dragging everything along its current, here seemed to have stopped entirely, becoming a still, bottomless lake. As the night progressed, the celebration deepened into something more spiritual. The Sídhe did not sing songs with words, but emitted long, breath-like vocal sounds that intertwined with the willow harp's music. It was a chant without fixed melody, a form of harmonic communication expressing emotion rather than thought. Khan felt his mind begin to tune itself to the chant. He did not understand the sounds because there were no words, yet he understood the meaning, a celebration of life, death, renewal, and the eternal connection between all things. Suddenly, the Sídhe woman who had received him rose and walked to the center of the clearing. She stopped before a large grey conical stone embedded in the ground, like a miniature menhir. On its surface lay a small wooden carving. It was a deer, its antlers extended like branches. It had been carved with a simplicity and elegance that Khan immediately recognized. It was not his work, yet it shared the same quality he sought in his own carvings, the ability to capture essence rather than appearance. The Sídhe woman placed her right hand on the deer. "This is the gift of the oak, Lord of Wood," she said, her voice resonating in the minds of all present. "A reminder of strength, dignity, and the connection to the earth that sustains us." She paused and looked at Con. "Each solstice, a craftsman from your world offers us a gift of wood, and in return we offer a gift of memory." A shiver ran down Con's spine. A gift of memory. What did that mean? The woman continued. "You are Con of the Three Ashes. Your name tells the story of your clan, of the 3 trees your ancestors planted on the hill of Tara. But you are the last of your line. Your shoulder does not ache from an old injury, but from the weight of memory you carry." Con stood motionless. How did she know all this? How could she know the history of his clan, the pain of his solitude? "You have walked alone for years, Con. You carve wood to fill the emptiness of your life. You seek beauty in inanimate things because you are afraid of finding it in people and losing it again." The woman's words pierced Con's mind like sharp blades. It was true, all of it. He had spent years fleeing his own past, the loss of his wife and child in a plague that had devastated his village. He had become a wood carver because wood does not die, does not fall ill, does not abandon you. Or so he had believed. The gift of memory we offer tonight is not a gift of forgetting. Forgetting is a form of cowardice. The true gift is understanding, the ability to see the past not as a burden, but as a root that holds you, like a grain in the wood of your own life. The Sídhe woman lifted her hand from the deer. "Come, Con of the Three Ashes. It is time to face your own memory." Con rose slowly. His legs felt weak, as if the mead had lost its effect. He walked toward the center of the clearing, toward the grey stone and the wooden deer. As he approached, he felt an overwhelming pull toward the carving, not the attraction of a craftsman to a well-made object, but something deeper, more primal. He stopped before the stone and looked at the deer. Its antlers stretched like tree branches, its dark eyes holding starry night. A wave of emotion rose within him, pain, nostalgia, regret. He reached out and touched it. At once, a sharp vibration ran through his arm, not the vibration of wood, but something deeper, a connection to his clan's past, to the memory of his life itself. And in that moment, the deer began to change. Its antlers turned into branches, its body into a knotted trunk, its eyes into living green leaves. Con felt his mind expand, linking with the network of roots beneath the clearing and the network of stars above it. And he understood. He understood that life was not a straight line, but an eternal circle, a cycle of birth, death, and renewal. He understood that loss was not an ending, but the beginning of something new. He understood that his solitude was not a punishment, but an opportunity to find connection with the earth, the universe, and the other world. Con stood still before the grey stone, his hand resting on the transformed deer. A deep, restorative peace filled him, one he had not felt in many years. The solstice night was drawing to its end, but for Con, a new dawn had just begun. The center of the clearing was not a space of conquest for the traveler, but a place where gravity itself seemed inverted. As he withdrew his hand from the small wooden figure resting on the conical stone, Con did not feel the impact of lightning, but the slow retreat of a tide. His fingers, which for years had pressed stubbornly against chisels to bend the knots of oak, now tingled with a strange lightness, as if his skin had become so porous that the air of the otherworld could pass through it without permission. The Sídhe woman, whom the others called Niamh, in a sigh reminiscent of dry broom pods brushing in August, did not speak at once. She simply watched the woodcarver absorb the silence. Around them, the vigil clearing continued its course with a calm that defied any notion of urgency. Two beings with translucent features, their Rough linen tunics seeming washed in the waters of 7 winters approached the oak table to place a new bowl, this time filled with wild hazelnuts whose shells gleamed like polished bronze. They did not speak. Their wrists moved with the slow rhythm of those who know that the night, though short in human calendars, contains all the hours the heart needs to empty itself. Khan returned to the stone where he had left his pack. He did not open it to retrieve another tool, but to confirm that the outside world still existed somewhere. The leather was damp with dew beginning to condense at the edges of the clearing, a thick dew that did not wet the clothes but coated them in a film of dull silver. His chisels felt cold to the touch, stable, anchored to the logic of iron that he still understood. That earthly cold became his anchor. "The wood has 2 memories, Khan," Neve said, appearing beside him without the moss making a sound beneath her feet. "The memory of the sun, which makes it grow upward in concentric rings, and the memory of the storm, which twists its fibers and creates knots. Men of your plains only seek clean wood, wood that offers no resistance to the axe. But those of you who carve know that the soul of a tree lies in its torsion." Khan sat again, letting his hands hang between his knees, his eyes now fully adjusted to the bluish luminance rising from the ground, fixed on a group of elder Sídhe, if age could even be measured, in beings who seemed as old as the hills themselves, who were weaving thin green willow rods. Their fingers worked without looking, with a domestic certainty reminiscent of village spinners in Carlo, though they were not making baskets for turf or river traps. They were forming small, spherical cages in which they trapped the floating lights drifting through the air. Once enclosed, the light did not struggle. It settled at the center, becoming denser, turning the color of old beeswax. "My father used to say a twisted grain is just a line that changed its mind because the wind blew too hard from the west," Khan replied. His voice no longer felt rough. The air of the clearing had polished it, stripping away the edges of isolation. "Your father was a man who knew how to listen to the forest before cutting it down," Niamh said, tilting her head. "Few remain who ask permission of the root before driving in the wedge. These days, men cut to possess, not to transform." The willow harp Sídhe, whose hair still carried the tone of rain-washed copper, began a new melody. This time the notes did not rise toward the stars, but dragged along the ground, searching the hollows of the grey stones at the ring's edge. The sound was dense, muted, like the lowing of a cow searching for its calf in morning fog, or the crack of ice breaking in winter troughs. At that sound, Khan felt the space between his ribs tighten. It was not physical pain from his shoulder, but an old invisible scar reopening each time winter arrived too early. In the bottom of one of the grey stone jugs, he saw the reflection of an extinguished hearth, soot-lined walls of a cottage where rye bread had turned to stone because no one was left to break it. He pressed a hand to his chest. One of the floating lights, now enclosed in its willow cage, was gently placed at his feet by one of the Sídhe weavers. The light emitted a subtle warmth that climbed through his legs, warmth that tasted of clean clothes dried in May sun, and of the fresh butter his wife, Mare, used to churn on Wednesday mornings. The memory did not arrive as a destructive blast, but as moisture soaking into dry wood, softening it from within. Khan did not look away from the wicker lantern. He remembered the scent of his son's hair, always tinged with peat smoke and goat's milk before sleep, so vivid that for a moment he believed that if he reached out, his fingers would find the child's unruly curls. "You are not losing her again, Khan," Niamh said softly, like an owl's feather brushing the dark. "Memory is not a broken vessel where water escapes forever. It is the well itself. The water is still there below, even if your rope is too short to reach it." Khan swallowed, The golden mead he had drunk earlier left a lingering taste of pine resin and clove on his tongue. "The well in my village ran dry the year of the Great Plague," he said, his words falling into the clearing like iron nails. "We buried the dead under hawthorn shade because the ground of the Abbey cemetery had frozen too hard. Since then, every time I take a piece of alder wood, my hands look for the shape of a small box. I cannot help it. Even when I try to carve a spoon or a whip handle, my fingers always round the edges as if they were shaping the sides of a cradle that will never be rocked." The nearby Sídhe showed neither pity nor surprise. In the other world, the tragedies of men were not seen as anomalies, but as the shadowed threads woven into the great tapestry shared by both banks of the river. Khan's grief was as natural to them as the fall of beech leaves in November, or the decay that allows a fungus to grow and feed the beetle. The wicker dyer, a being whose fingers possessed the flexibility of marsh reeds, approached Khan and held out a small shard of grey stone, perfectly flat and polished by the waters of a stream untouched by mud. "Place your sorrow in the stone, wood carver," Niev said, gesturing toward the object. "Wood changes with the seasons. It swells with rain and cracks beneath drought. But stone is a guardian that never forgets the shape it is given. Your kind writes with ink that fades or with words the wind eventually denies. We keep things where time has no teeth." Khan took the grey stone between his rough fingers. The contrast was immense. The man's weathered skin, hardened by linseed oil and the cold of wandering workshops, against the perfect, cold, eternal surface of the mineral. He closed his fist around it, squeezing so tightly that his knuckles turned white, and the edge of the pebble dug into his palm, precisely along the lifeline the elders claimed had been broken. There was no visible magic. No sparks burst from the stone, and the light of the clearing did not change in brightness. Yet within his chest, Khan felt the pressure that had prevented him from taking a deep breath for 5 years begin to transfer itself, drop by drop, grain by grain, into the heart of the grey stone. The pain did not disappear. A man without his pain is merely an empty husk driven down autumn roads by the wind, but it ceased being a parasite feeding upon his strength and became something defined, something he could examine from the outside, something with boundaries and weight of its own. When he opened his hand, the grey stone was no longer cold. It carried the warmth of his own skin, and at its center, where once there had only been the uniformity of stone, a concentric line had appeared. A dark ring mirrored perfectly the growth ring of an ash tree that had survived a year of merciless drought. Niamh lifted the stone from Khan's open palm with a reverence no king of Ireland would ever receive from his people. She walked to the center of the clearing and placed it in a small hollow at the base of the conical menhir, directly beneath the deer figure that still breathed its subtle vegetal life. "Now the hill will keep it," Niamh said, turning toward him. "When you walk the paths of Meath or the forests of Carlow, you will know that your sorrow is not lost to the wind. It rests here, in the roots of Glenasmole, protected by the ring of stones that iron cannot break. You may carve spoons again, Con. The cradles will no longer claim your hands." The music of the willow harp changed once more, becoming lighter, almost joyful, carrying a rhythm that echoed the trot of a young roe deer through damp heather. The floating lights emerged from their wicker cages, the woven rods unfolding by themselves like flower petals opening beneath the midday sun, and began to dance in concentric circles above the black oak table. They illuminated the bowls of berries and the jugs of mead, which were once again full, as though the night itself refused to consume its provisions before the traveller had fully quenched his thirst for peace. Con looked at his hands. They rested calmly upon his thighs. The subtle tremor that had accompanied him since he left his native village was gone. The solstice air still flowed around him, dense and sweet. And for the first time in many years, tomorrow no longer seemed like a threat. It was simply the next turn in the grain. The music of the willow harp did not cease, but it underwent a subtle transformation. The notes no longer crept along the ground like winter fog. Instead, they gained a steadiness that Con recognized immediately. It was the rhythm of a human heartbeat settling after a long shock. The floating spheres of light, now freed from their wicker cages, gathered above the great black oak table at the center of the clearing. They did not mingle together, but maintained a precise distance from one another, like embers in a well-tended hearth that refused to die while respecting the space of the neighboring log. Beneath that clean golden glow, the clay bowls and grey stone jugs revealed new details. The texture of the clay displayed the thumbprints of whoever had shaped it upon some forgotten hillside, circular grooves where the dust of time had become a dull glaze. Niamh returned from the conical menhir with empty, clean hands. She stopped before Con, studying the stillness of his fingers. "The well is no longer dry, woodcarver," she said, and her voice carried the scent of fresh-cut timber when the first shaving falls to the workshop floor. "But an artisan cannot remain empty-handed during the vigil. The night of the solstice demands that the guest leave a mark upon the wood of the otherworld, not as tribute, but as proof that iron and willow have met." Con rose. The pain in his shoulder was nothing more than a distant memory now, a stream of water that had found another path through the rocks. He walked toward the ancient oak where he had left his leather pack. When he opened it, the smell of linseed oil, beeswax, and old iron rose to meet him. A familiar household scent that felt as precious in that clearing as incense inside an abbey. He did not choose his tools hastily. His fingers brushed over the broad-bladed chisel whose ash handle had been darkened by years of sweat before stopping on a small curved gouge, a delicate detail tool that his father had tempered in the forge of Kilmeaden using rainwater collected during the month of May. It was a slender blade, sharpened so finely it could split a hair in midair, designed not for rough shaping but for discovering the most delicate veins hidden near the bark. "I have no wood with me," Con said, turning toward Niamh. "I carry only steel. The forest above provides the material when the road requires it, but here the branches belong to another memory." Niamh answered without words. She extended a hand toward the black oak table and, with a graceful motion of her long fingers, indicated a piece of wood resting beside the jugs of mead. It was a rectangular block of yew, roughly 2 spans in length, rough on the outside but colored in a way that stole Con's breath. The yew of the human world was usually a muted red, almost veined like flesh. This one, however, carried the hue of old gold, mingled with the shadow of red wine. It bore no visible knots, yet its grain ran in tight spirals as though the tree had grown while listening to the stars turning around the axis of the sky. "This yew fell from the hill of Uisneach before the first men built their mud huts," said Niamh. "It has waded beneath the hill, protected from the air that rots and the fire that consumes. It is wood that has never known the bite of an axe, Con. It knows only the weight of time." Con approached the table and laid his gouge beside it. He lifted the block of yew with both hands. He expected it to be heavy and cold like a river stone, but found it strangely light, almost as weightless as birch bark, while retaining an inner warmth, the gentle temperature of a small animal sleeping beneath hay. When he brought it close to his face, the scent it carried was not that of ordinary resin, but something deeper. A fragrance of crushed ivy leaves and the damp earth hidden beneath the roots of royal fern. He sat upon a low stool carved directly into the end of the oak table and placed the block of yew between his knees. The scattered Sídhe throughout the clearing fell silent. The wicker weaver, the women in grey robes, and the copper-haired harpist approached with slow steps, forming a second ring around the table. They did not watch him with the demanding curiosity of men attending a fair to judge a craftsman's skill. They watched with the patience of stones observing moss grow, with a gentle expectation that sought not amazement but communion. Con placed the edge of the gouge against the upper corner of the block. In his workshop in Meath, the first cut always required a sharp strike from an applewood mallet to break the resistance of the outer grain. Here, however, no mallet was needed. The moment steel touched the yew, the fibers seemed to open of their own accord, yielding to the tool with a soft whisper, a continuous shh, like the brushing of a linen skirt through dry grass. A long, perfect shaving, thin as a wasp's wing and glowing with translucent gold, peeled away from the block and drifted onto the moss. When it touched the ground, it did not remain inert. For a few seconds it retained the bluish radiance of the clearing before gently fading and becoming sweet mulch. Con had no design prepared in his mind. A poor woodcarver, he always believed, is one who forces his will upon the wood, who sketches an abstract shape in charcoal and compels the trunk to fit it through the violence of metal. A true artisan merely removes what is unnecessary, allowing the form already hidden inside the tree to emerge at its own pace. And within that block of Uisnich yew lived something Con knew intimately, though he had never seen it with mortal eyes. His hands moved with ritual regularity. The gouge entered the wood following the spirals of the grain, rounding edges with a patience that emptied the world of haste. With every movement, the silence of the clearing became denser, more welcoming. The willow harpist accompanied the rhythm of steel with scattered notes, deep pulses that aligned perfectly with the moment the gouge completed its path, and Con gently blew away the fine dust gathered in the channels of the carving. Slowly, a subtle relief began to emerge from the rectangular mass of yew. It was neither the face of a god nor the insignia of a warrior. It was the silhouette of a human hand, an open hand whose palm lines were shaped not by the blade's cuts, but by reverence for the natural grain of the wood itself. It was a woman's hand with long fingers and rounded fingertips, a hand that seemed extended not to ask for anything, but to cradle the fall of a leaf or the final drop of afternoon rain. Niamh leaned slightly over the table, her eyes fixed on Con's work. The floating lights gathered above her head, casting golden reflections that made the carved yew appear alive, pulsing with the same invisible sap that flowed through the ash trees of the valley. "You are carving the return, Con," she whispered, her voice blending with the song of the harp. "You are carving the hand that releases its burden so it may receive stillness." Con did not stop until the surface of the wood had become so smooth that the gouge could find no resistance at all. He used neither oxhide nor dried rue leaves to polish it. The natural fineness of the Uisnich yew allowed his fingers to glide across it like frozen well water in winter. When he finished, he laid the tool upon the table and held the piece up to the light of the clearing. The wooden hand seemed to emerge from the yew itself, joining the human and the vegetal in such an organic way that it was impossible to tell where the tree ended and the work of man began. The lines of the palm aligned with the growth rings of the yew, telling a story that belonged neither to Con nor to his wife Mary, but to the long memory of the earth they had both walked upon. The wicker dyer approached and, with profound courtesy, lifted a small clay bowl containing a thick, transparent oil pressed from the seeds of the blue flax that grew in the hills of the Sídhe. Con dipped his fingertips into the warm liquid and began spreading it over the carved yew. The wood drank the oil eagerly, taking on a richness of color that bordered on the sacred. The old gold grew brighter, while the purple shadows hidden in the grain seemed to gain a third dimension, as though the wooden hand possessed real veins through which the light of the solstice flowed. When the finishing oil had been applied, Con placed the piece at the center of the black oak table, between the bowls of wild berries. One by one, the Sídhe approached and extended their long fingers to touch the polished surface. They voiced no judgments, Yet the way they bowed their heads and the way the air of the clearing grew warmer and more fragrant with every touch was the only approval a woodcarver could ever desire. Niamh looked at Con, and within her large dark eyes there was none of the distance of the beings of the other world, only the simple understanding of someone who shares the same household secret. "Your tribute is paid, Con of the Three Ashes," she said, and for the first time the distant murmur of an outer stream could be heard, a sign that the solstice night was beginning to bend toward dawn. "You have left the mark of your people upon the ancient yew, a mark that carries neither the edge of the sword nor the greed of the plough. You have left respect, and that is something we guard more fiercely than the veins of gold men seek within our hills." Con cleaned his gouge with a scrap of raw linen and returned it to the leather pack, fastening the buckle with a slow and final motion. The iron of his tools was returning to its rest, but the hands that had guided them were no longer the same. They carried upon their skin the scent of the yew of Uisneek and the warmth of an oil untouched by the passing of winters. The scent of winter apples began to lose its sharpness, not because it faded away, but because the air of the clearing was slowly filling with the damp, cold fragrance of real dew, the kind that comes just before the first light of morning in the world of men. Niamh remained beside the black oak table, gazing at the yew hand Con had carved. The other Sídhe began retreating toward the edges of the stone circle with movements that no longer echoed the stillness of the constellations, but the gentle scattering of dry leaves when the wind shifts direction. The copper-haired harpist removed his instrument from his shoulder. The spider silk strings no longer glowed with their own light, but had taken on the dull grey opacity of ordinary linen after the last candle in a room has gone out. "The weave is tightening, Con," said Niamh. Her voice no longer resonated inside the woodcarver's mind with its former clarity. Now it seemed to come from across a narrow stream, softened by distance and foliage. "Those of your blood cannot withstand the gaze of the other world once the sun truly claims its place in the sky. The solstice is a bridge that lasts only a few hours, and the day of man is a jealous master." Con felt the weight returning. It was not the sharp pain in his left shoulder that had bent him through the last several winters, but something more subtle. The physical awareness of his own bones, the rough scrape of wool against his neck, the genuine cold of the earth beginning to seep through the soles of his leather shoes. The golden mead that had filled his veins with the lightness of a bird now seemed to have settled at the bottom of his stomach like a thick sediment of grain and running water. He approached the conical menhir where Niamh had placed the small grey stone bearing the circular grain of his memory. As he bent down, he saw that the stone no longer radiated warmth, yet the concentric line remained there, fixed in the granite like the scar left by lightning upon the bark of a beech tree. "Does it stay here?" Con asked, and his own voice sounded strangely rough to him, full of road dust and disuse. "The hill does not return what it accepts, woodcarver," answered a voice behind him. It was not Niamh. It was the elderly Sídhe who had woven the wicker cages. He carried a final wooden sphere in his hands, but this one contained no light. Instead, it held a handful of cold ash, grey and fine as the dust left behind in the millstones of an abandoned mill. "What you leave in Glenismall no longer belongs to you to suffer," the elder continued. "It belongs to the forest now to nourish the roots of the hawthorn. Your cradle is empty, Con, but your hands are free once more for the haft of the axe and the spine of the gouge." Niamh stepped closer to the woodcarver and, for the first time since he had crossed the boundary of the stones, extended her long fingers and touched his forehead. Her fingertips were as cold as November frost, yet the contact filled him with absolute clarity. It was a sensation of open space behind his eyes, like standing upon a hilltop after a night of storms and seeing the horizon laid bare in every direction. "Do not look back when you leave the clearing, Khan of the Three Ashes," she said. As she spoke, her outline began to blur, mingling with the white strands of mist rising from the forest floor. Men who look back during the solstice become dead trees fit only for shepherds' fires. Your road is not finished. The grain of your wood still has many turns left before it reaches the heartwood. Khan lowered his head, closing his eyes for a moment longer to preserve the image of the U-hand resting upon the table, the floating lights fading like weary fireflies, and the face of stone and water belonging to the woman who had returned peace to him. When he opened his eyes, the bluish radiance had vanished completely. The clearing was no longer a place of perfect geometry. The ring of grey stones remained, but now the rocks appeared worn and weathered, covered in ordinary brown moss and stained with owl droppings. There was no black oak table, no grey stone jugs, no trace of the rye bread that had restored his strength. Only the rotting stump of an ancient willow remained, a tree that must have fallen generations ago, its broken roots jutting from the earth like the ribs of a ship stranded upon a sandbank. The light filling the forest was a pale, ashen glow, a cold grey twilight filtering through the canopies of tall trees. It was the dawn after the solstice, the moment when the year begins to age, almost without noticing. The air smelled of wet earth, decaying leaves, and the sour scent of ferns rotting in the shade. There was no trace left of wild apples or beeswax. Khan found himself standing beside his leather pack at the foot of a young ash tree. His hands were cold and covered with a fine layer of dew that bore none of the texture of silver, only the ordinary consistency of water gathered in the valley. As he slung the pack over his shoulder, he felt the rhythmic impact of his tools against his thigh. The clink of steel against the chisel's metal was now dull and familiar, stripped of every magical resonance. And yet, as he took the first step toward the path reappearing among the hawthorn thickets, he realized something had changed. His gait was different. His left shoulder offered no protest beneath the weight of the leather strap. The joint moved with a smoothness he had not known since his youth in the lowlands of Meath. His feet found the stable stones of the path without conscious effort, as though his boots already knew where roots lurked beneath the soil and where soft mud waited beside the ditch. He walked for an hour in silence, allowing the forests of Glenismole to open gradually around him as the land descended toward the plain. The birds of the human world began their morning songs, the sharp trill of a blackbird searching for worms among the moss, the distant cooing of a wood pigeon hidden high among the branches of a beech tree, the harsh cry of a crow patrolling the grey sky in search of whatever carrion the night had left behind. It was noisy music, disordered music, full of the urgency of survival. Yet to Khan, it sounded beautiful, a testament that life continued forward with a stubbornness no shadow could ever halt. When he finally emerged from the forest, the sun broke fully above the horizon. It was not a triumphant golden sunrise. It was a pale brightness, a disk of dull silver barely strong enough to dissolve the mist drifting over the barley fields of the plain. Far away, the columns of smoke from the solstice bonfires lit by the villages the previous night rose into the sky like lazy grey threads, fading before they ever reached the clouds. Khan stopped beside a dry stone wall that separated the road from the grazing fields. He removed his linen handkerchief and wiped the dew from his face. As he looked down at his hands, he noticed that the skin of his right palm, where the edge of the grey stone had pressed into him during the vigil, still bore a tiny concentric mark. It was a subtle brown ring that perfectly resembled the growth ring of a young tree. It caused no pain. It was simply a sign, a reminder invisible to anyone who was not a woodcarver. He slipped a hand into his pack and felt a small piece of wood he did not remember storing there. He drew it into the daylight. It was a shaving from the ancient yew of Uisneek, a thick curl that had broken from the main block during his first cuts with the curved gouge. Under the pale light of morning, the wood no longer shimmered with the purple radiance of the other world, yet it retained that deep, old gold color and a faint, nearly imperceptible fragrance that carried the scent of crushed ivy leaves in the stillness of ancient hills. Con smiled. It was only the slightest movement of his lips, witnessed by no one except the blackbird perched atop the stone wall. He slipped the shaving into the pocket of his vest, close to his heart, and resumed his journey toward the next village. His pack was still heavy. His gouges were still made of iron. The road ahead was still long, but the cradles would no longer claim his hands. The woodcarver was returning to his craft, carrying the solstice within his chest like a root that refuses to die beneath the snow. The return to Meath. The journey back to the plains of Meath was not an escape. It was a slow settling of the spirit. Con walked not with the urgency of a man fleeing a ghost, but with the patience of an ox that knows the weight of the yoke and the consistency of mud after a storm. The daylight that followed the solstice settled over the barley stubble with an ashen steadiness, a clarity that offered little warmth but returned everything to its exact outline, restoring each thing to its condition as an object subject to the wear of wind and passing days. By midday, the outline of Kilmeaden appeared on the horizon like a scattering of grey peat clods thrown across the hillside. The smoke rising from its chimneys was no longer the mystical thread of vigil fires. It was the thick breath of cooking hearths, the fire that boiled oats and heated water for washing swaddling cloths. The world of men was reclaiming its right to ordinariness. Con did not stop at the tavern where, days earlier, he had traded away his alderwood spoon. Instead, he headed directly toward the outskirts of the village, where the boundaries of the gardens dissolved into a slope thick with nettles and wild brambles. There he found the blacksmith's cottage, a low adobe workshop whose thatched roof had been stained black by years of forge smoke. The blacksmith, a man known among the villagers as Mute because of his stubborn devotion to silence, sat upon a pine bench sharpening a plowshare with a grinding stone. The sound of steel scraping against mineral grain was a high, rhythmic complaint that filled the air with the smell of extinguished sparks and old iron. When he saw Con, the craftsman did not raise his eyes from his work. He merely pointed with a slight movement of his chin toward a corner of the workshop where a three-legged stool waited for the traveler. Con lowered his pack to the floor with the same soft metallic clatter that had accompanied him throughout the entire journey. Con sat down on the small bench, resting his hands on his knees. The palm of his right hand, where the concentric line of memory had settled into the skin, felt warm as though it still held a trace of the blue flax oil the Sídhe used to protect the yew of Uisneek. "I come from Glenismole," Con said. His voice no longer carried the gravel of isolation. Instead, it possessed the clear steadiness of water that has finally found its level within a well. The blacksmith stopped turning the grindstone. The silence that settled over the workshop was thick, broken only by the steady dripping of cooling water falling from the wooden barrel onto the stone basin below. He studied Con's hands, lingering on the concentric scar in his right palm, then glanced toward his forge where the dying coal still held the pale color of cold ash. "The forest stands high this year," the blacksmith replied, his voice sounding like two pieces of iron slag rubbing together in the bottom of a drawer. "Those who enter it during the solstice usually leave their tools behind." "I brought mine back," Con said as he loosened the leather buckle of his pack. "But the wood I seek now is not the kind cut for the boxes of the dead. I have come to ask a favor of you, craftsman of fire. I need your forge to lend me a heat that is not meant to temper steel, but to soften what has become too hard inside my chest." The blacksmith rose without haste. his body, broad and bent from decades of hammering metal upon the anvil, moved with a heavy grace that reminded Con of the knotted giants of the Vigil clearing. He picked up a bellows made from oxhide and began feeding air into the forge. An orange glow, dull at first and then bright yellow enough to sting the eyes, blossomed from the heart of the hearth. Dry heat filled the shed, instantly driving away the damp traces of Glenismole's dew that still lingered within the folds of Con's tunic. Con slipped a hand into the pocket of his vest and withdrew the sliver of ancient yew that Niamh had allowed him to keep. As the wood touched the warmth of the forge, it released one final breath of its primordial fragrance, that scent of crushed ivy leaves and the deep stillness of hidden hills. He did not throw it into the fire. Instead, he carefully placed it on the blacksmith's workbench beside the iron compasses and the wide-jawed tongs. "Do not burn it," Con said quietly. "Only let the warmth of your hearth soften it enough for my gouge to enter it one last time. There is one final carving I must uncover before the year begins to grow cold." The work lasted 3 days and 3 nights, the same span of time it takes the moon to change her face above the hills of Meath. Con did not return to the roads. He remained in the corner of the forge, sleeping upon a mattress of clean straw that the blacksmith had provided, and sharing with him the rye bread and butter the village women brought in exchange for horseshoe nails. There was no hurry left in his hands. Every cut he made into the sliver of Wisnik yew was a circular motion, a gentle caress that followed the spirals of the grain with a patience that emptied the workshop of any notion of urgency. The blacksmith asked no questions. He merely kept the forge fire at a constant heat, a domestic and protective warmth that prevented the ancient wood from cracking in the chill air of June mornings. Sometimes, when the silence between them became too dense, the mute man would hum an old farming tune, a melody without words that resembled the hiss of rainwater sinking into freshly turned earth. From the small piece of yew there emerged neither a figure for an abbey altar, nor an amulet to hang around a child's neck. Instead, there came a small rectangular object, no larger than the palm of a child's hand, a writing tablet framed in polished wood. Yet where beeswax should have filled its center, Con had left the yew itself exposed, its growth rings laid bare like the lines of a map no one alive could read. On the reverse side of the tablet, the woodcarver carved 3 small trees whose trunks intertwined into a single crown. They were the 3 ash trees of his lineage, the mark of his clan. No longer a sentence of loneliness, they had become a root, anchoring him to the land of Ireland with the same quiet dignity as the conical standing stone of the Vigil clearing. On the 4th day, when the morning sun finally dissolved the mist that covered the plain, Con rose from his bench. He gathered his tools one by one, cleaning each with his rough linen cloth before placing them carefully into the compartments of his pack. The steel shone brightly, clean, free of the rust that neglect so often leaves behind in abandoned workshops. He approached the blacksmith, who still stood beside the anvil with a hammer in hand, watching the sunlight stream through the open doorway. "Your fire is a good one, mute man," Con said, extending his left hand in farewell. "It carries the strength of iron, but also the respect of willow." The blacksmith took his hand in a brief, rough grip that left a streak of grey soot across the woodcarver's skin. He looked at the yew tablet hanging from Con's belt by a hemp cord and nodded once. A single final nod that expressed all the approval a craftsman needed to continue his journey. Con left the village of Kilmeaden behind and followed the path leading westward toward the highlands, where oak forests blended into the peat bogs of Carlow. The road was the same as it had always been, rocky, lined with dry stone walls and yellow gorse bushes whose blossoms carried the sweet scent of coconut and summer sunlight. Ox carts rattled past him with the creak of poorly greased axles, and shepherds greeted him from distant hillsides with a lift of their staffs. The world of men continued its course with its debts, its harvests, and its small domestic joys. But for Con, walking was no longer an escape. With every step he felt the gentle tap of the U-tablet against his thigh, a steady rhythm that matched the beating of his own heart. Eventually he came to a bend in the road where an old solitary ash tree grew beside a well of drinking water. The tree was ancient, half its crown had been killed by a lightning strike from some forgotten winter, yet fresh green leaves still sprouted from its lower branches, trembling in the afternoon breeze. Con stopped beside the well. He set down his pack and knelt by the stone basin to quench his thirst. The water was cold and pure, carrying that mineral taste that speaks of a hill's hidden heart. When he lifted his head, he saw his reflection upon the surface, a face marked by 25 winters, fine lines around the eyes that told the story of wind and carving tools, yet the gaze staring back at him no longer searched for shadows. It accepted the pale light of the open plain. He removed the U-tablet from his belt and laid it upon the stone rim of the well. As the ancient wood of Uisnich touched the damp stone, it seemed to release one final drop of its invisible oil. A tiny circular stain spread across the water's surface, catching the colors of the rainbow for a brief moment before dissolving completely into the purity of the spring. "The solstice is over," he said softly to himself. His own voice sounded like wind moving through the leaves of the ash tree. "But the root remains below." He slung the pack over his shoulder, adjusting the strap across the shoulder that no longer pained him, and continued westward. The road was still filled with stones. Winter would return in its appointed season with its frosts and its long nights. But Con the woodcarver no longer walked alone. In his pack he carried the steel that respected the tree. Upon his hand he bore the mark of the hill of Glenismole, and in his pocket rested the sliver of old gold yew that reminded him with every heartbeat that the beauty of life is not found in the symmetry of flawless wood, but in the strength with which the grain twists and bends in order to survive the storm.